Nintendo home consoles have always had some form of competition, ever since the NES brought the resurgence of video games back in the 80s. And while that competition has fluctuated over the years to say the least, the story for handheld systems is very different. Since the Game Boy, Nintendo has had an iron grip on the portable market. Unlike home consoles, many came along to try to dethrone Nintendo as king, with Sega's Game Gear, Atari's Lynx, and in more recent years, the Sony PSP and Vita. Sandwiched in between all these failed attempts is SNK's Neo Geo Pocket Color. The Neo Geo Pocket Color is an odd case. For one thing, it didn't last a full year here in the States, with initial sales showing promise, as they all do, before SNK pulled the plug in the summer of 2000. It also doesn't help that it was released when Nintendo had a stranglehold on the market thanks to Pokemon being the biggest thing on the planet at the time. That was also the reason that the Neo Geo Pocket Color had the bare minimum of third-party games, the biggest being Sonic Pocket Adventure from the partnership SNK and Sega entered so the Pocket Color could connect to the Dreamcast for certain titles. But that doesn't mean you should write the Pocket Color off. Quite the contrary, the flash-in-the-pan system has a ton of neat features and games that was way ahead of its time, some we haven't even seen since. The Neo Geo Pocket Color doesn't sport the traditional D-pad, but instead a very clicky analog stick. The Pocket Color was not a powerful system by any stretch of the imagination. Though more powerful than the Game Boy Color, an analog stick might seem like overkill. That's before you consider the library of games the system has, of course. A large majority of the Pocket Color's titles are ports or remakes of arcade games, more specifically, fighting games. SNK's goal wasn't just to take another game with you on the go, but instead, an entire arcade experience. And with that mentality in mind, the stick works very well. Pulling off Hadokens and Match of the Millennium is just as easy and fluid as any normal controller. The stick also feels right at home with games like Bubble Bobble and Pac-Man 2. Even platformer titles work well with it. The whole system feels great, in fact. Not too small, but the right size to be portable. The Pocket Color isn't the first handheld to be played horizontally with the screen in between the controls, but I'd say it was the first to do it well. With only two AA batteries, the Pocket Color didn't have the bulk or weight like the Game Gear or Lynx did. The Pocket Color is also one of, if not the only handheld console I can think of that needed one of those big watch batteries to function. This external battery serves a few purposes, the biggest being an internal clock as well as a calendar. Oddly enough, the Neo Geo Pocket Color could also tell your horoscope if you're into that. Outside of the alarm clock, there wasn't much else the battery does, but it's still interesting all the same. As to be expected, the Neo Geo Pocket Color isn't perfect. In fact, there's two pretty big blemishes, the most obvious being the screen. While the Pocket Color looks good with some remarkably detailed backgrounds and vibrant sprites, the screen falls into the same trap as prior handhelds. If you're not in an especially well-lit area, you're gonna have a rough time seeing what's going on. Granted, the Pocket Color isn't nearly as bad as the original Game Boy Advance, but it's a little hard to get used to after being spoiled by backlit screens for ages now. For years, handheld and consoles alike have had a start button that is designated to stop the game. Some people might call it a pause button. The Pocket Color doesn't have one of those, instead opting for an option button. I know that sounds nitpicky, but let me explain. Most games use the option button as pause. This is fine. But certain other titles use it for switching weapons or other functions like in Metal Slug, while also using it as a pause button. You can see where this is a problem. Tapping the button will cause you to switch. Holding will pause the game. The problem is that the timing between the two is fickle, and Metal Slug isn't the only game that does this. The bottom line, while not a ton of games have this issue, a select button of some sort would have been preferred. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was a great little system for its time. To this day, you can get it and a bundle of games for relatively cheap, and I'd highly recommend it. While not a perfect system, the minimal blemishes it has are nothing compared to the positives. But why would you pick up one of these novelties based solely on its merits, you say? What about the games? Well, guess we better take a look at some of the titles the Neo Geo Pocket Color has to offer next time.